So, Casey, there are a few topics on this show that one or the other of us has always been reluctant to talk about because we think it's boring. For you, this is semiconductors. And for me, this is European tech regulation.
Mm-hmm.
But this week, you are forcing me to talk about European tech regulation. And my first question is, why are you doing this to me?
It's a fair question, Kevin, but look, I think a question that undergirds a lot of the journalism that you and I have done is, hey, these tech companies have done nothing but get larger and more powerful ever since you and I started to write about them. Should we maybe try to rein that power in? And if so, how could we do it? We live in a country that has offered essentially no answer to this question. There's been endless hearings and screaming, and people write laws that go nowhere. But what if I were to tell you that just across the ocean, there was another democracy that had big ideas for how you could maybe start to chip away at that power and maybe distribute it a little bit more broadly across the land? What if I told you that, Kevin?
I would be slightly more interested. Is that happening?
We're getting somewhere. Yes, Kevin, we are. Because in 2020, the European Union began to pursue what would become the Digital Markets Act. It also has a twin, by the way, called the Digital Services Act, which we're not going to talk about today. But these are sort of twin bills that in various ways try to rein in the power of big tech. And it is a very long process to get a law enacted in Europe. But the reason we're talking about it this week is that this was the week that the law went fully into effect. And so for the biggest companies in tech, they now have new obligations, and so they have been rolling out changes at a fairly rapid clip so that they are in full compliance with this law.
They're calling it Digital Markets Day or D-Day. No, that's something different. So I have been seeing various stories about tech companies that are attempting to sort of comply or at least pretend to comply with this new European tech regulation. It's a little it gets very complicated in all the details, but I'm hoping maybe you can help me understand what is going on and why I should care.
It would be my great privilege and honor to explain to you some of the provisions of this law, Kevin. Look, the overarching principle here, which I bet you would agree with me about this, is that if you are one of the real tech giants, so we're talking about Google, Apple, Amazon, Meta, you shouldn't really preference yourself all the time. Like, you know, if you ever just like look up a flight on Google, you immediately see a box that says Google Flights.
Right.
Well, most people just use the default. And so Google has built a system that just funnels all kinds of travel revenue directly into its coffers. Now, that's not evil necessarily, but it does mean that if you want to start your own business where you're selling flights, you're at a massive disadvantage against this company that is Google. Or think about if you buy a Windows PC. And I bet you've done this recently because you bought a gaming PC.
Yes.
And do you know what the default search engine was on your gaming PC that you bought?
Probably Microsoft's Bing.
It was Microsoft Search, Microsoft Bing. And did you find that annoying? Did you have to change it?
No, because I probably installed Chrome, on which the default is Google.
Right, but my point is there was something you had to manage because
Yes.
one of these tech giants said, hey, we're just going to give ourselves a helping hand. Our market cap is in the trillions. We're going to give ourselves another helping hand up. And then along comes the DMA, Kevin.
Yeah, and the DMA says you can't do this.
That's right. So there are a bunch of changes in here. That Google Flights example that I mentioned, that is no longer going to be the case. In Europe, Google is going to get rid of that flights box, and other companies that are selling air travel are going to have a fair crack at things. Microsoft is no longer going to be able to set Bing as the default search in Europe. And there's more. You know, Apple is having to open up its iOS operating system so that people can bring in their own app stores, their own payment systems. So if there's an app that, for whatever reason, Apple won't approve, well, now maybe you're actually going to be able to run it on your phone. You paid $1,000 for the damn thing. Maybe you should have some say about what software runs there. Am I making any sense over here?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard bits and pieces of this, and I actually have heard much more about the Apple piece of this for reasons that we should go into because they have been sort of rolling out all these changes in a way that strikes me as very, sort of undermining the spirit of the DMA. But I do think this is like starting to show up in real products that real people, at least in Europe, are using all the time.
Let me give you another example.
Yes.
You ever paid with anything with Apple Pay?
Yes.
You know, you sort of double click the little button on the side of your phone and you're able to touch it down on a little NFC reader and you're able to pay for something. That's a nice experience.
Yes.
Kevin, what if you were running your own payments company? Do you think you might actually want to insert your own little payments app onto the iPhone? Would that that could be cool, right? Guess what? You can't do it because Apple said no. Even though, you know, again, you're the consumer. You paid $1,000 for the dang phone. Apple is just deciding that you can only use the NFC chip for what Apple wants. Not in Europe anymore, my friend. So who knows what kind of crazy payment solutions we're going to get over there in Europe.
So, okay, Europe has passed this law, the DMA.
Yeah, and let me do a quick check. How excited are you about everything I've just said?
I'm more excited. Honestly, you're doing a pretty good job of convincing me that I should care about this.
Yeah.
So I recently learned about something called looping for understanding. Have you heard about this?
No, I haven't.
This is from my friend Charles Duhigg, who just wrote a book about communication. And he says that part of being a good communicator is doing looping for understanding. So I'm going to repeat back what you've said to me.
Verbatim, please.
Yeah. And you tell me if I'm on or off base.
Okay.
So, looping for understanding. Europe passes this law, the Digital Markets Act, or DMA. Yeah. By this week, tech companies had to show how they're complying with this.
That's right.
This law does many things. Among them, it makes it illegal for certain big tech companies, the very biggest ones that the EU has designated as gatekeepers, to self-preference, to show their own products and services ahead of competitors on apps that they own or platforms that they control.
Yeah.
They also have to make their messaging apps interoperable in some way so that you can get messages on any app and send them to every app.
Say that, yeah.
And they have also forced Apple to open up its app store, basically to allow you to sideload apps onto your iPhone without going through their official app store.
Exactly.
Okay. Those are the big headlines from the DMA. Anything I'm missing?
Those are some of the big ones. Look, there's a lot in there. I could give more examples, but I think that's like a pretty nice little package of stuff that might actually affect you, the listener, or you, Kevin, in your life that is going to happen as a result of the DMA.
And is this stuff just applying to European users? Like for people who are not in Europe, will they see changes to the apps and services that they use as a result of the European digital market, as a result of this law?
Not yet, but let me tell you, Kevin, regulators around the world are paying attention. Japan, South Korea, Turkey, and the United Kingdom are all contemplating their own versions of this law, according to Bloomberg. So I would be shocked if we passed something similar at a federal level in the United States, but I would not be surprised if individual states look to the DMA, particularly if it is successful, and look to implement similar rules in their own states.
Right. So the most I have read about the DMA and its various effects was actually about Apple and how it is complying or attempting to comply with the Digital Markets Act. There was an amazing post written a few weeks ago by John Gruber on his blog Daring Fireball that sort of broke down what Apple is doing in response to this new European law. And I think it is truly worthy of being described as dastardly.
Yes. It is one of the few times we've described anything on the show as dastardly, but this is A1 dastard right here.
So basically, Apple is given this new set of rules by European regulators saying you have to open up, the iOS platform. You have to allow these other app stores that are not your official app store. You have to let people sideload apps onto their phone. And they respond by rolling out this series of changes for iOS users and developers in Europe. And one of the things that they do, according to this post that I read, is that they tweak the way that they do payment processing for apps. So basically, right now, if you want to process payments inside an app on an iPhone, you have to use Apple's payment processing system, and they charge a fee for that. The DMA says Apple can no longer require you to use their payment processing system. You have to allow people to use other payment processing options. Apple responds basically by saying, okay, you are forcing us to open up the App Store and introduce this other payment processing method. We are going to impose something called a core technology fee. This is something that they've never imposed before. Basically, if you are a developer making an iPhone app, and you choose not to use Apple's default payment processing system and pay them the associated fee, Apple is instead going to charge you an annual install fee for everyone who downloads and installs your app, over 1 million downloads per year. So if you are Spotify and you get many more than 1 million downloads, you are now going to have to pay about 50, what do you call it? 50 cents of a euro?
It'd be 50 cents of a euro, or euro cents as they call them over there.
So every time someone installs one of your apps every year, so this could amount to millions of dollars a year that these developers would have to pay Apple.
I mean, honestly, tens of millions of dollars a year. Spotify came out with a group of other large app makers, and they said, we will wind up paying more money in all likelihood to use Apple's new system that was designed to save us money than we would if we just stayed on the old system, in which we were also, at risk of losing money.
Right. So Apple says these changes will only apply to a very small percentage of developers, but
which is such a cop-out because, it's like the very small percentage of developers who make the absolute most money for Apple. It's like most app developers make no money for themselves or for Apple, but there is 1% of companies that are making all the money, and that's whose money Apple wants.
And that was who was complaining about these rules in the first place, was companies like Spotify.
Exactly.
So Apple is basically arguing that because they build the iPhone and the App Store and the infrastructure and all the review processes that go into making sure that apps are safe when they're put in the App Store, that they are entitled to these fees from developers. They've also said that the DMA will effectively make users less safe because you'll be able to sideload these apps that haven't gone through their whole review process. You could get things that are offensive or pornographic or have malware in them or something, and that this is ultimately going to backfire for consumers.
Whenever I read Apple saying about something harming consumers, I just always replace the word consumers with profits, because then I think you get a sort of closer approximation of what Apple's really mad about. It's like, wow, if we have to implement these rules, it's really going to harm profits, and profits are not going to be happy about this. Profits are going to be banging down our door saying, we hate this.
Are you familiar with the subreddit malicious compliance?
I did not know there was a subreddit.
So I love, this is one of my favorite parts of Reddit. The phrase malicious compliance. It's basically,
it's like, I'm going to find a way to follow your rule, but in the worst way possible.
Exactly. It's like I'm complying with the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. Like the example is like, if your kid asks like, can I have a bowl of ice cream? And you say yes, then they like bring out the salad bowl, like the biggest bowl in the house. And they go, you didn't say what size bowl. Like that is malicious compliance. And that is essentially what Apple is doing here.
Did you ever use that trick, by the way?
No, I didn't, but I should have.
It would have been smart.
So Apple has basically said, okay, you want to force us to open up the App Store to allow alternative app stores, to allow alternative payment processing options. We are going to make it very expensive for you to do that. But basically, we are now in compliance, we believe, with the DMA.
Yeah. And I suspect we're going to see a lot of litigation around this. And, Apple is not alone in challenging various aspects of the DMA. And as excited as I am about some of its provisions, I'll be the first to admit there is no guarantee that this stuff is going to work as intended. And one of the big reasons is exactly what you just said. These American tech giants are being dragged into the future, kicking and screaming, and they are going to cling onto every penny that they wring from our pockets for dear life. And I truly am taken aback by how aggressively Apple's been fighting this.
Yeah, so it's not just Apple fighting it. Google has also, come out with some sort of statements about how they believe this is going to be bad for consumers. So I guess this is my big sort of overarching question about the Digital Markets Act, because I remember a few years ago, European tech regulators passed this thing called GDPR, which was, I forget what it stands for, General Data...
RuPaul's Drag Race.
I don't think that was it.
Okay.
But basically, it was this big sweeping privacy law. And I interviewed a bunch of European tech regulators, and they would, give these, sort of stem winders about how they were preserving dignity and privacy for their citizens and keeping data sovereign inside the EU. And it sort of sounded like, they're storming the Bastille or something like that. And then fast forward a couple years, and the only tangible effect that I have felt as a user from GDPR is that whenever I go to Europe, I have to spend spend like half my day clicking through little buttons that say like accept cookies or reject cookies. Like that is the only thing, honestly, that has changed as a result of GDPR for me.
You don't even have to go to Europe to have that experience. You can just sit on your laptop in America
But have you
and
ever
click on
gone
those cookies.
on the European internet in Europe?
I sure.
Wow, it's like playing a video game. Like, how many times do I have to click through a screen to accept cookies?
There are aspects of it that are really silly, but look, I think GDPR had one really good idea in it, which is that if a company is out there somewhere collecting data about you, you just have a right to know that. You should be able to petition any company that's been collecting data about you, saying, "Hey, what do you know about me?" And after it was passed, that law got copied in other places, among them California, where we live right now. Which means that if you're worried that one of these companies like Clearview AI is collecting 1 million pictures of your face and then selling it to a police department, you as a Californian can now go to a regulator in the state and say, "Hey, I want you to tell me everything that you know about me and possibly even delete those things." So did GDPR create a bunch of silly pop-ups that affect no one in any positive way? Sure, but there were good ideas there, and I feel like we see this with European tech regulation all the time, which is it never gets us all the way to, oh, phew, big tech has been reined in, we can now move on with our lives, but it does introduce these little ideas that are good, that can get picked up by other countries, lawmakers, regulators around the world.
Can I ask you a couple other questions?
Ask me.
So we know from sort of the history of tech regulation that often, tech companies will fail to comply with some new law and they'll get fined or they'll get their wrist slapped, but the fine is, not. The fine is not big enough to actually force them to try to change their practices. It's just kind of a slap on the wrist. So is that the kind of thing that we can expect to see more of here with the DMA, is just like companies violating this law, getting fined by European regulators, paying a fine that's chump change, and then they continue to go on with their lives?
Yeah, well, so the DMA has a provision where if they're found to be in severe violation of the rules, they can be fined up to 20% of their global revenue, or as they call revenue in Europe, turnover. Did you know that in Europe they call revenue turnover?
Wait, really?
Yeah, and in America, turnover is a pastry, but in Europe, it is revenue.
Really?
So they can be fined up to 20% of their global turnover / revenue.
Wait, I don't get that. Why do they call it turnover?
I guess it's just because, you got the money coming in, you're turning it over and putting it into a bank. Like, who knows? Who knows why they do things in Europe? I'm not European.
Wow.
Yeah.
That really bothers me for reasons I can't articulate.
Yeah, well, anyway, look, let's just say that 20% of revenue is not a slap on the wrist. It is a punch in the mouth.
And do we have any sense so far? I know it's very early because just this week the tech companies were required to show that they're complying with this new law. But do we have a sense yet of whether it's working as intended?
Well, no, is the answer to that. Our producers put a great question in our prep document this week, which was, how will we know that the DMA is working? And it's a tricky question to answer, right? Because I would love to tell you that because the DMA went into effect 10 years from now, there's going to be 5 major search engines and 6 major smartphone operating systems and 11 major e-commerce platforms around the world, right? To me, that would sort of be the ideal, is that we distribute the balance of power much more broadly across companies, across regions. It doesn't feel like the fate of humanity is in the hands of 5 companies. That is like what I actually want. The DMA is not going to get us all the way there. But I do think it can get us some of the way there, right? If Google isn't putting its own vertical search results on top of so many different categories of searches, there might be room for new competitors. New kinds of businesses might be able to be created. So my hope is that this will create conditions where entrepreneurs can come along and build cool new businesses that mean just slightly less money goes into the coffers of a tiny handful of companies.
Yeah, I would say that so far what I am feeling about the Digital Markets Act is sort of analogous to what I'm feeling about the lawsuit that Elon Musk filed against OpenAI, which is like, does this make a lot of sense on its face? Hard to tell. Maybe I'm skeptical that the actual complaints here are valid, but I do think that there is a process of learning that is taking place here and of public education around what is the structure of OpenAI? What is the structure of the Apple App Store? How does it sort of treat developers? What are the terms of building apps for iPhones? Like, these are questions that I think a lot of people have not historically known the answers to and are now finding out through the process of watching these tech giants try to comply with this new law. So regardless of whether or not the DMA has the intended effect, I feel okay about its existence because we're just learning so much more about how these companies operate. And also, like, it's a lot better than some of the alternatives, right? And I think if 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, we look back and say, hey, the internet is actually kind of broken in Europe, it's easy enough to sort of undo the regulations there. I don't think there's anything wrong with running the experiment.
Yeah, I agree. It's very easy looking at any new tech regulation and figure out a million different reasons why it probably won't work. It won't have the desired effect. It'll have these unintended consequences. And that can be an excuse for tech companies to essentially throw up their hands and say it's not even worth trying. And I am just here to say it is worth trying, okay? We do not want to live in a world that is run by 5 for-profit corporations. We want to figure out a way to make them open up a little bit, play nice with others, create opportunities for other companies, and this is the most significant effort we have seen in the world to do that so far. So while, again, I am skeptical that it's going to get us even halfway to the finish line, it is a place to start, and we can build from here.
And let me just kind of steelman the opposition here that you will hear from people in the tech industry and people who work at these companies and have you respond to it. People in the tech industry will say, this is Europe trying to regulate because it can't innovate, right? Europe has not built any companies that are the size and scale of Google or Apple. And the people in the tech industry who are skeptical of the DMA will say this is just them trying to clamp down on innovation, that Europe is sort of turning itself into a technological backwater. They don't have a huge, vibrant startup scene there, in part because they have decided to strangle promising new technologies with regulation rather than letting them play out naturally. What do you say to that argument?
I mean, I think I can honestly just accept it and say, but it doesn't really matter, right? Because in the United States, where we don't have any regulation, we're also not seeing a lot of innovation. When was the last time a huge successful new search engine came along, or a huge successful new social network came along, or a huge new successful e-commerce company came along, or a huge new successful smartphone operating system came along? We have all the room to innovate here in America, and we have none of that, right? So I think it's just a good thing that there are some countries on Earth that want to encourage innovation a little bit more. And I do think that these are pro-competitive steps that they are taking that will sincerely benefit companies both in Europe and elsewhere.
Casey, I have to say, you have convinced me that this particular European tech law matters.
Thank you.
And then I need to pay attention to it, which I thought was impossible.
Well, it was my pleasure, Kevin. You know, often on this show, you are driving the train and you do a fine job at it. And I get intimidated when I have to try to walk you through something. But this was something that I really wanted to go through because I think it matters.
At the very least, I think that we should continue to follow up on this story by taking ourselves on a European vacation later this year and seeing how the DMA is putting itself into practice. What do you think?
What is our travel budget? Have we ever looked into that on this show?
No, but I think our turnover is high enough that we can justify at least a week. Come on.
Hey, that's the end of this clip. If you liked what you saw, head on over to our page and subscribe, and you can get the full podcast. We do a show like this almost every week on tech and the future. Head on over there now and subscribe.